Hello and welcome to Promoting Proactive and Predictive Logistics, a dispatch from SOF Week 2024, brought to you by GDIT. I'm your host, George Jackson with GovExec TV. Sustainment and logistics are the beating heart of all military operations. They ensure U.S. service members are equipped for the mission ahead. The integration of cutting-edge technologies can facilitate data-driven decision-making throughout the supply chain, enhance efficiencies, reduce costs, and improve effectiveness. Today we'll cover how Special Operations Forces can utilize new technologies and data to protect and enhance supply chain resilience and practice proactive and predictive maintenance in sustainment operations. Let's kick things off with Colonel Jesse Marsalis. He is Program Executive Officer for Special Operations Forces Support Activity, SOFSA, USSOCOM. Sir, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, George.
Retired Major General Kurt Sonntag is former Commanding General for the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School at Fort Bragg and former Commander for SOC South. Great to see you, sir.
Good to see you as well.
Chuck Daly, VP and General Manager of ARMA Global at GDIT. Always a pleasure.
Yep. Thank you, George.
So, Chuck, kick us off. You know, back in the day, shipping, storing, fixing, these weren't connected enterprises, disparate spreadsheets. What are we looking at the current state of logistics?
Yeah, correct. You think back even 20 years ago, it may have been someone with a clipboard and a sheet. Maybe 10 years ago, that went to a spreadsheet. Now that data is unstructured, right? So it's in a spreadsheet, but you can't search, you can't do something with it. And that was a activity unto itself. It may have been someone loading something in a warehouse with a forklift. Today, and where we're going is there's sensors on all that, and it may give you information about when it was shipped, what's the remaining service life on that item, what's the maintenance status of that forklift, right? And what does that do for maintenance? And it ties to the shipping, it ties to the storage, it ties to the usability of that, and all that data is now structured and it's connected, and it gives meaning to the decision makers, in this case, the Department of Defense, on what to do. And so you have to collect that data, you have to structure it, and then make sense of it so decision makers can do something with it.
General, where is that space going? Where will it sort of be in the future, 5 years down the road or so?
So I think the use of the sensors is going to enable commanders to make better informed decisions on the employment of forces based upon their readiness levels or their predictive readiness levels as they move forward. For instance, if you have forces scattered across different countries, but one of them is getting ready to do an operation, but some of their systems are indicating that the likelihood that they're going to become non-mission capable over the next 30 days, but you have a supply chain that, you know, is routing certain parts to another unit that's maybe not as high in priority. It gives the commander enough time to ship those resources into his priority so that he ensures that he's got a full mission ready capability as he moves forward onto whatever op he has to do. This is going to literally change how maintenance is done forward based upon a commander's battle plan.
As we continue to lay the foundation for this conversation, Colonel, let me introduce a phrase, contested environments. Talk to me about what that means to logistics, why it's incredibly important.
You know, SOF teams are already used to operating in remote and austere environments, but even today, they can be assured that they are eventually going to get supplied, right? What we're looking to do is to allow them to be able to extend their ability to operate in those remote and austere environments from 2 weeks to 2 months, to 2 months to 6 months in those contested environments when supply chains can't reach them.
Chuck, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about the cyber risk aspect that is introduced here. Austere environments, certainly a challenge. The more sensors you have, the more data that's flowing between these networks means new cyber risks for the Department of Defense. Why is that important? How do you address it?
Yeah, George, it's, the NDS, the 2022 National Defense Strategy really identified our peer, or really the great power competition, the China, Russia, and as the biggest threat to America. With them comes a very sophisticated cyber threat. And then you think about the future of logistics that Kurt mentioned, and even in the contested space, as the Colonel mentioned, we're to stitch all this data together that I mentioned in my first, the first part of my response. You're talking about a network. You're talking about data. It has to be stored. It has to be secured. And in order to do that, it's vulnerable now to attack. So the cyber attack space has now gotten greater. So we have to pay more attention to our cyber defense and what we do to protect that data, so that it's an assured supply chain. The integrity of the supply chain is trusted by the Department of Defense.
Sure.
So if I may tag into that a little bit. So the other aspect to it, it's not only the data storage and then analysis of but the transport. We need protected transport of that data at very specific times, because at some point you might not be able to have the steady stream of data that you would normally enjoy, in a commercial setting or in a non-contested setting. You might only be able to burst out certain times so that you don't get tracked on where you're at. But that data becomes increasingly important, not just to inform, but also to tie into, whatever support systems that you need to keep your forces moving.
General, if I could ask a follow-up, as that data transfers, it transfers between more varied parties than ever before. The military has been moving in this direction called the joint warfighting concept. Could you talk a bit about what that is for the edification of our audience and how it sort of layers on to the logistics elements of our conversation?
So the beauty about special operations is, although we're service-like, we are part of the joint force, and the way in which we fight is part of the joint force. We have to be able to communicate across the joint force. So our ability to integrate into whatever technical systems that they're developing can become challenging at certain times, because services can be a little bit parochial at times. So we got to be able to tie into those systems. In many cases, because we have subcomponents of each of the services within SOCOM, Army, Air Force, Marines, Navy, some of their equipment is service-like. And so we try our best to ensure that, there are certain aspects that are soft peculiar is already integrating those systems, so that we can then, kind of make it more soft, but without disrupting our ability to communicate across the joint force.
What does that look like at SOFSA, sir? Communication, I guess, specifically. Like, who are you communicating with? Maybe it's in person, maybe it's via data.
So the data is the big piece here, right? So we've got decades of data that we've already collected from being at war for so long that allow us to ensure that we forecast the parts and the pieces that are going to be necessary to sustain those capabilities when we push those teams forward, when those teams integrate into the joint force, when they deploy, and so that they're not becoming a burden upon the logistics team that they're integrating with, but they are adding value to that joint force when they deploy.
Before we went on the air, Colonel, you used the phrase proactive logistics. What does that mean? What did it used to be? What is it going to look like?
Well, proactive, what it used to look like to me, I remember the lean manufacturing, the just-in-time manufacturing, and since the years that I learned that, things have changed just a little bit. We had a pandemic, a lot of global conflict, trucker strike, et cetera. So there's been a disruption in the logistics chains that we've seen here in the United States and abroad. What we're considering now to be proactive, recognizing that those things can occur. We can't be just in time anymore. We're thinking more just in case. We assess the risk. We ensure that we mitigate the risk for our soft teams forward. So maybe the commanders, instead of depending on those, that metal line of communication running back and forth between the United States, they need to ensure that they have those parts packages pushed forward as far forward as possible to the soft teams to ensure they can fix themselves.
So I want to really add on to what Jesse's saying here, because it's extremely important that it's not just the time anymore. We can't build up irons of mountains of steel forward anymore, because everything's going to be contested. And the just in case piece ties directly into what the Theater Special Operations Commands should be doing in terms of campaigning their way into these theaters and getting an understanding of where the potential threats lie. And then while they have time, ensure that they have logistics that are already established forward or non-standard logistic supply chains that can supply them in case something does go wrong. But this is why it's important that we have our forces forward at all times, so they have an actual understanding of what's available. They can tie back into what his organization can provide forward through the TSOCs. But in many cases is, hey, what can the local supply chains support, which then relieves some of the additive requirements that's going to come from the United States or other supply chains.
Chuck, the general leads me to where I want to go next, which is some of the potential benefits of doing this next generation of logistics for the military. You know, data more seamlessly integrated and more visibility or better informed decisions at the tip of the spear seems like one obvious benefit. What are some others, maybe some long-term benefits or short-term?
Yeah, I think it's, both the general and the colonel mentioned basically supply chain risk management. So that's at the end of the day, whether it's forward in a contested way or back here in the States, it's identify the risks, assess the risks, and mitigate the risks. And I think the future holds with a data-driven approach. You can use artificial intelligence in all three of those areas. It could be data that's collected about weather events, and you know that in this, as you're assessing risk, in June, this might be a likely weather event that could happen. And then as far as assessing the risk, okay, what's the likelihood? What's the impact? What is the assessment of this risk? And the data, once again, shows you in the past, this is what manifested based on what we saw on the precursors in the identify, right? And then in the mitigate, now we're providing data for decision makers, right? So there's still a person in this chain, and they're helping to make decisions on how do we mitigate this risk. Do we go with a hard force, a partner force that might have ability to mitigate the supply chain? Do we have another technology, another route? So really, when you start looking at the data, how it can be used, it really, at the mitigation stage, is giving options to the commanders on what they can do. But you have to really get the data right and the data structure right. It's going to take a little bit of energy to do that. But once you get that done, you have a more efficient supply chain and a more a supply chain with a lot more integrity.
We saw a lot of equipment on display here a little earlier today. The sort of masses here at SOF Week are going to see a great display again tomorrow. And it makes me think of, on the other end of that proactive approach to logistics, those pieces of equipment being more effective, more usable by the military while they're out in theater. Am I reading that right, Colonel?
Oh, absolutely. That's what the SOF 18L enterprise does best, right? Working with our operators to ensure, first of all, the operators within SOCOM are probably some of the most demanding customers that you'll find in the Department of Defense, and they're not, they don't hold their words slowly when they have something that's not working for them. So I think SOF 18L is doing a great job in ensuring those SOF operators have the most effective gear when they deploy.
General, is there a cost component to this conversation as well? I'd imagine that, there's a barrier to entry, but once you move beyond that, things sort of flatten out and decrease. Would I be reading that right?
So I think there's different ways to view cost, and so for any commander out there, depending on where they're at, the closer to the fight, there's a different way you measure the cost, but you're always looking for ways in which you can reduce manpower, time, or money requirements so that you can reinvest those into other requirements that you might not be able to get after. But at the end of the day, everything ties into, can I reduce risk to my men and women that are out there doing what they have to do? That's the most critical factor. If I can do that, then I'm willing to accept a higher price point. I'm probably willing to accept, more manpower in order to get a reduction in risk. And then time is always one of those things that's one thing you can never get back. So, where you can save, That's always good. And so there's a lot of different ways you can do that. And I'm not sure how the questions go, but as you lean towards the just in case aspect that you're talking about, there are things that you can pre-position into these areas so you can reduce bulk transport requirements, fuel, water, batteries potentially. Can you put additive manufacturing capabilities so you can do rapid repair of smaller systems? So there's a lot that can be done. There's a cost, but the higher cost is if you increase risk, then you're not doing the right thing.
Colonel, I'd like to introduce maybe a slightly different subject, and that's talent, manpower, the actual people behind initiatives like this. The force has more digital natives than ever. How does that shape or guide what the military is doing in logistics? What does it require of the force that wasn't there before?
So I'll assume you're not calling me old.
Certainly not.
No, we see it every day. At SOFSA, we've got folks that we have recruited that are coming in that are just blowing our minds with what they understand in the IT infrastructure, and they're teaching us. They're bringing these great ideas that they're learning from their colleges and we're working with academia and showing us the better ways. And so we're carrying that through. For instance, we've increased the manner in which we manage our raw materials at SOFSA, leveraging an ERP through learning about some new systems and technology that has saved us a significant amount of money and time because we've reduced the touch labor as a result.
General, I'll ask you to put back on your John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School at Fort Bragg hat. That starts with education. How has education changed? Does the military in those higher education institutions need to focus on different elements?
So I think it's not the elements that they need to refocus on. I think some of it is training methodologies. So in many cases over time, everything was done by rote. Not so much anymore. We mentioned the virtual capabilities that exist. My predecessor that came in after me, he gave me a really good vignette. So at SWIC, refer to the schoolhouse up there, part of the last bit of training for the primary pipelines of our Special Forces, PSYOP, and Civil Affairs soldiers is language, and sometimes up to 6 months. And we have an exceptional language program there. But one of the things that we were learning, this was a few years back, was the soldiers that are coming through today, less likely to be this close having this conversation. They were a little standoffish. When COVID hit, everyone broke back out into the rooms and everything was being done virtually. They were scoring better because they were doing something that they were comfortable with and operating in a virtual environment than they would be in a classroom. As it was like, it's enlightening. So again, the way in which the folks coming into service now, they think differently. What motivates them is differently, and they're looking for cutting edge on everything, and it needs to be digital.
Sure.
Actually, the general was part of the integration of Tactical Assault Kit. When that first started getting fielded within Special Operations Command, the first operators didn't want it, but leaders such as yourself started seeing the value of it, and then they started seeing cycles of operators come in, young SEALs, Green Berets, and if you go out there on that conference floor now, if it can't communicate within TAC, then they don't want it.
What does industry bring to the equation, Chuck? And what does this require of industry down the road?
Sure. I remind of a quote that said, logistics is the bridge between military operations and the commercial sector. It's probably the one most tied to industry of all the different warfighting functions. And you talked about the digital natives. We're getting fresh young talent. I mean, at its heart, GDIT is a technology company, really focused on solving hard problems for the Department of Defense and the government writ large. And so what we bring is fresh ideas. Oftentimes we're outpacing DoD because we can. We don't have the risk factor. We don't have the military operation factor. We're effectiveness on the battlefield at the edge is what's most important. We're able to do some research and development. At GDIT, we have something called digital accelerators, which are really just playbooks that we customize for our government customers to help them modernize and innovate. So we have a framework, we have technology, we have research, we have really some fresh, young talent with some incredible ideas on how to do that. And then, the partnership with the government is really important. Just something as simple as setting up SLAs, service level agreements, that are predictive, not reactive, that incentivize us to be predictive and to really, skate to where the puck is going, not to where it is. So that's just a small example of a way that we could partner and really drive the outcomes that the government and Department of Defense is looking for.
So, just you want to go on that? So he brings up a great point. So I've been out for a few years, and I think the challenge is that over time, probably starting in the 70s, the advancement of various types of technologies has shifted from the government to industry. So in industry is innovating at a rate like this. Problem is we still got archaic systems within the military and the government. And the other challenge is, as this innovation occurs, the ability for industry to scale at a speed that allows the military in particular to properly integrate and train everybody to where it can actually make a difference is challenged. And so, because we're used to like in the Army, it's a big Army. If you want to bring in completely new IT systems across the board, the old way has always been, we've got a fielding plan. It's going to take 10 years, 10 years in this, and you might as well go back to it, the old rotary phone, for those that remember, because there's some in this room that don't remember that, right? So we have to, the military has to be more innovative in the way we can integrate what industry can provide.
Colonel, tie a bow on this for us, sir. What did we miss?
There's one thing I didn't get to mention, and that's the capabilities that the SOF operators are actually pushing themselves, leveraging the acquisition arm of Special Operations Command. One example of that is the contested, if you walk back to the contested logistics just for a minute, SOF operators have foreign weapons that they have to be trained on a regular basis. Well, some of those weapons we can't get parts for, at least not consistently. And that's a big issue, right? We have to have consistent, open pipelines of parts for everything that we have. Well, when the SOF operators saw that they had that challenge, they brought that to SOFSA, and SOFSA immediately reversed engineered. Well, it went all the way up to OSD, coordinated with the OSD Intellectual Property Office, and lawyers can never give you permission, but they gave us a risk analysis. So now we have provided the process for the Special Operations Command components to make their own parts. So they're doing it now down at USSOCOM, down at the place Sarah that you used to own it, and they are now making their own parts for some of the foreign weapons legally, right? So now carry that forward. So now we're going to build that library of small arms parts, and now we're coordinating with the industry to see, now give me a deploy capability that I can give to that Green Beret, to give to that SEAL, give to that Ranger, so they can make that part for themselves downrange.
Great example to close with Chuck's call to modernize and innovate. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being here. Colonel Jesse Marsalis, Program Executive Officer for SOF Support Activity, USSOCOM, retired Major General Kurt Sonntag, former Commanding General for the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School at Fort Bragg and former Commander for SOCOM South, Chuck Daly, Vice President and General Manager for ARMA Global at GDIT. Great conversation.
Thanks, George. Appreciate it. George. Thanks for having us.
We're going to take a quick break. Up next, I'll continue our conversation about predictive and proactive logistics with Dan Folliard, the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Officer for USSOCOM, a pair of his colleagues, and an expert from GDIT. You're watching GovExec TV. Be right back.
In the Special Operations Force's global supply chain, operational priorities continue to evolve to keep pace across the entire spectrum of conflict. Within every domain that SOCOM operates in, there is a need for comprehensive logistics management services. For more than 50 years, GDIT has provided the largest scale supply chain management solutions to the global community. Informed by over 2 decades supporting USSOCOM and SOF worldwide, GDIT provides precision maintenance and sustainment at the point of need. Today's missions require increased speed, security, and transparency. That's why GDIT is the only systems integrator to be recognized for their performance in supply chains and logistics operations. Building on a track record of proven delivery for SOCOM in the operations, communications, and intelligence domains, GDIT combines unsurpassed expertise in operating global logistics with the technology solutions that today's missions demand. We address emerging threats and gaps in supply chain risk by applying commercial technology to provide data-driven decisions. From artificial intelligence and machine learning to zero trust, GDIT integrates logistics solutions that enhance predictive maintenance, reduce lifecycle costs, increase interoperability, lower performance risk, and ensure operational availability of mission assets. At GDIT, we are committed to supply chain success at any scale and technology innovation that moves at the speed of SOF, anytime, anywhere in the world. GDIT Logistics, precision sustainment at the point of need.
Welcome back to Promoting Proactive and Predictive Logistics, brought to you by GDIT. I'm your host, George Jackson, with GovExec TV. To achieve and sustain readiness, it's critically important to utilize emerging technologies and data to both protect and enhance supply chain resilience. I'm excited to continue today's conversations on how to engage in proactive and predictive maintenance in logistics and sustainment operations with a great group of experts. Joining me now, Dan Folliard. He is the Chief Digital and AI Officer for USSOCOM. Sir, welcome.
Thanks, George.
We have 2 of his colleagues here on the panel. Mike Petee, USSOCOM Materiel Manager, welcome.
Thank you.
And Chris Paone, Senior Logistics Director for USSOCOM. Good to see you, sir.
Same, George. Thanks for having us.
Brandon, last but not least, Brandon Bean, AI and ML Capability Lead for the Defense CTO at GDIT. Good to see you.
Thank you.
So Dan, kick us off. Your office, talk a little bit about the portfolio that you maintain and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, thanks, George. So I'm the 3rd generation Chief Data Officer, now Chief Digital and AI Officer at U.S. Special Operations Command. And, the main task is to transform the command to be more data-driven. And I kind of chunk up my responsibilities into 3 buckets. And the first, I would say, is very institutional. It's focused on implementing the data strategies. So everything from data governance, data management, and policy through to AI education. The second is focused on what I would say applying data and AI for actual insights, right? And so that's where I get to interact with teammates, particularly in our J4, but really across the breadth of functional areas to empower them to use their data better. And the third bucket is focused on experimentation. So we're very focused right now on large language models and generative AI.
Mike, before we went on the air, you talked about one of the sort of key initiatives for you, and that's, I'll call it blocking and tackling for data. Right. Data cleanliness, data aggregation. Why are those so important? What do they require of you, of the team?
So, our goal is to be able to present actionable information to senior leaders to make decisions. And it's the tools Dan and his team are making on dashboards, et cetera, for the senior leadership. So our main goal is to make sure that the data that the CDAO's team is capturing is accurate, it's complete, it's concise, it's current, and it's consistent. So with managing those 4 C's, we know that the data that is being presented and turned into actionable information is complete so that the leadership can make good decisions on how to employ forces or how to redeploy equipment, et cetera.
What does that look like on the logistics side of the house? When that's done or executed effectively, Chris, What's the result from a mission perspective?
Yeah, so I think, from a mission perspective, the end result is always improved readiness, or readiness that supports our service members having the right equipment at the right time in a not just a working fashion, but in a fashion that allows them to continuously service and use that weapon system, maritime system, et cetera, et cetera. To Mike's point, distilling that down to our customer base requires us to work exclusively with the services, the components. We'll have potentially different readiness priorities, but there's a tremendous opportunity now to create sort of the nexus between what's available in terms of data and what's happening on the ground on our systems, and linking operators and sustainers to the diagnostics on those systems.
Are we starting to see depot operations change, Brandon? What's different today than 2-3 years ago?
The availability of data. That's kind of the bottom line. 2, 3, 10 years ago, maintenance was done in silos. Aviation was really the first vertical where we saw a lot of integrated maintenance. GDIT, as a subsidiary of General Dynamics, has a sister organization, Gulfstream Aircraft Corporation. They've been leading the way in commercial aircraft in terms of integrated maintenance. But on the military side, actually, SOCOM has been leading the way with the 160th SOAR, the Special Operations Aviation Regiment. They've developed an integrated maintenance solution that allows them to get to a pretty granular level with not only the aircraft but components, and that's been a big part of it. If we were to extrapolate some of the issues with maintenance on the depot level, I would probably say that we would want to start looking at the surface and subsurface soft vehicles. Those are usually maintained disparately, so not just one company maintains them. There's not one logbook. A lot of the records are manual. To get a unified picture of the health of that craft as well as all of its systems, it can be very difficult. And so, we really need to start looking at the unified data picture and making sure that we're generating processes around being able to generate that data. In many cases, it's already there. We just have to be able to bring it all together. On the aircraft side, we have FADEX systems, which are automated engine controllers that generate data, also using inputs from the aircraft systems to be able to control the engine. So a lot of that discrete data is available to us. We just have to harness it to be able to drive that decision support cycle.
Chris, I was watching you out of the corner of my eye, and something resonated in there for you.
Yeah, thanks, George. I really wanted to have Mike ref on maybe the work we've done now with our maritime team within, the team that's put a lot of this together, our SOF AT&L counterparts. Can you spend 2 minutes just talking about how we've leveraged depot maintenance in support of not just cataloging, but taking some of the slack out of it?
So one of the things they've identified with Naval Special Warfare Command, their combatant crafts, there was a sustainment strategy that was initially developed that worked for initial fielding of the equipment, heavy on contractor logistics support. But now as the systems have matured and there've been more operational availability, more operational data, failures, et cetera, they were be able to capture, we've been able to start tracking demand information. We've also identified some potential issues with having one item cataloged 4 different ways. So what we're trying to do is standardize that portfolio, that catalog of repair parts for the combatant craft, so that when the tactical level person orders it, he really doesn't care who it's coming from. He knows I order this national stock number, that's what I'm going to get. It could come from 20 different vendors. It's irrelevant so as long as it's the same item. So we're able to manage, capture all that, consolidate their portfolio of repair parts. We're also looking at the demand levels so that the teams at the tactical ledge who are doing the maintenance, making sure they have the right parts in both the range, meaning the number of parts, and the depth, the quantity of each one of those parts, so they can do their maintenance and not always be a lead time away from fixing the equipment because, hey, I don't have it on the shelf. I got to wait for somebody to go out and buy it and have it shipped to me. So we're trying to make that sustainment strategy more robust in the combatant craft, especially as we foresee future deployments where they're going to be on their own by themselves and maybe 5,000 miles away from a supply depot to be able to get them those parts.
Dan, I love tangible examples like this, especially in these really high-level IT conversations, because it draws us back down to earth. And to me, it begs the question, how do you choose those projects? Like, logistics is huge. Anything that's stored or fixed or shipped. Like, when you are trying to apply artificial intelligence, machine learning to a logistics solution, what types of paces do you have to put that through before farming it out, putting it into practice?
Yeah, George. So, kind of goes back to the old adage, you just eat the elephant one bite at a time. The reality is we've got quite a bit of legacy debt. We've got some serious data issues, and we'll never get to, kind of the full potential of AI until we resolve, the foundation of, our data and data management and data governance. So, we have to do sort of the blue collar work on the data first. But really, to answer your question, part of it is we have to have a really tight relationship between the users and our data scientists and data engineers. Kind of the idea of kind of side by side, field to learn, the ability for us to partner in a really tight way so we understand their problems and we understand their data picture. To me, you have to start off just through this relentless incrementalism because we all want to get to AI, but we've got to just start the journey, and we've got to just make incremental progress, towards cleaning up some of this legacy debt.
What has to happen to the cloud, Brandon, from an infrastructure perspective, or the way that industry and government partners through the cloud to sort of execute on what Dan lines up there?
So I think this is kind of I won't say it's a loaded question, but there are a lot of variables that need unpacked to really be able to get to that. The first one is rationalization of the applications that we want to get to the cloud, right? We want to get to AI, ML, but as Dan said, we have data problems, right? Being able to unpack those, having a resilient architecture and data pipelining infrastructure set up that will allow us to use the data that we need once we get the apps to the cloud is kind of the first step. And that's what we see at GDIT, and a lot of the work that we're doing is the customers, and Dan kind of alluded to it, everybody wants AI, ML. It's the elephant in the room, right? Ever since ChatGPT and OpenAI came on the scene in October 2022, it's been nothing but generative AI. And there are a lot of requests for information and requests for proposals out there for generative AI, but again, it all comes down, as Dan said, to that foundation of data. And a lot of organizations aren't there and aren't ready with their data. So what we find when we come in is we're really working hard to help them get to that, whether it's modernize their IT service management infrastructure, to get them on a pipeline to where we can get them, through an innovation roadmap to say, okay, hey, you're not there yet. We want to get you there. And we can do that in a few years by doing these incremental steps. It's kind of putting the cart before the horse. Everybody wants the shiny object, but, unfortunately, you don't want to polish the brass. So that's really, what we're seeing in terms of that. But in terms of cloud, to get to that where, we have that capability, we have to start. And a lot of it's going to be rationalizing those legacy applications that are going to need to be moved to the cloud, or to set up hybrid infrastructures where some of those that we can't get to the cloud, we have to maintain on premise and be able to build that resilient infrastructure between the two so that we can get that data pipeline set up to be able to still leverage the data from that system, but then modernize and move forward.
Mike?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've done with respect to data, we know there's a lot of legacy data out there that's, there's problems with it, but we drew a line in the sand about a year ago and said specifically with cataloging of soft peculiar equipment. We put a line in the sand that says from this point forward, there are multiple data elements that need to be present that we can then leverage on the back end to do analysis, et cetera. So what we decided to do is we drew a line in the sand that says, okay, before we need all this data from program offices, whoever holds the initial data, so that when we build the records, all that data is there, so we don't have to go back and chase it in the back end. If you look at it, I like to use this comment of, if you learn from your mistakes, we got to be geniuses, because we've made a lot of mistakes. But the thing is, we've been lucky enough to have the leadership that allows us to make mistakes, because that's how we learn and that's how we grow.
Brandon?
That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Policy, right, is one of the biggest things. And Dan has a really tough job as a CDAO because it's a unique position where you're required to help strategize and bring forward this innovation, but you don't own the tasking authority to make people do what it is needs done. So there's this nuance there, and to see that commands are actually starting to do that and say, hey, we're going to draw a line in the sand and we're going to do this. It's something even when I was in uniform that I argued over and over and over, with commands on, and to see that that's happening is monumental. So not only, is that important, but I'm glad to see you guys are taking that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just say, we do tend to default to a discussion on infrastructure. The reality is, the data strategy that the command is in execution of, it's about Vaultus. It's about complying with the Deputy Secretary of Defense's data decrees memo from a few years ago. It's also about people, right? So it's about data. It's about having the talent, right? Not just software capacity, but data literate, and data professionalized, workers within each of the functional domains to be able to help put it all together. So, a lot of what we spend our time on, and it's a command-wide effort, is focused on the execution of our data strategy, and it comes down to data, people, and architecture. So we always come back to the people side because we're SOCOM, but the reality is that we've got a long way to go, right, to have a more data literate workforce, and so that's something we're trying hard to do.
Chris?
Yeah, Dan, we've talked, we've kicked this week off rallying around people win transform. And you're right. Thanks for bringing up the people perspective. We had for a long time a lot of savvy young soldiers who were used to a very binary system, a lot of keystrokes that produced a requisition that enabled them to fix, repair. Now we're asking them through this effort to be able to understand the data that's available. They're a part of that, and then be able to use it as the end user, the operator sustainer, is able to forecast for his boss and his line manager, and then up through to eventually the component service. And for us to affect policy oversight gets back to that responsibility and auditability. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so, you bring a really good point up in the fact that we have digital natives now, right? And these digital natives are used to having technology at their disposal from, in some cases, birth now. We've had to shift using these more binary systems where sometimes you had to memorize shortcuts and keystrokes and everything else to get things done in a rapid manner. And if they didn't happen in a certain sequence, then the whole process failed. To now teaching these same people the ones and zeros behind the data, right? The importance of the ones and zeros and how the data moves, and the importance of data integrity and veracity, things that they were, they weren't accustomed to before. And it's interesting to see there's a dynamic there where, yes, we have these digital natives, but we also have to not forget some of those legacy processes as we think about DDoS, right? So when we get to those areas where we have denied, degrade, intermittent, or late communications, sometimes we got to pull out the acetate, right? And I kind of hark back to that coming from an Intel background where technology will fail, and if it fails, you still have to have the ability to do that. So we still need that muscle memory, which is good. Some of us, that have been around for a while kind of like that mentality where everything, being highly data-driven within the logistics community, but still being able to think about those processes and how we can optimize even maybe at a smaller probability, right, of success on the other end, but still being able to do that if we do lose that capability.
Dan, you opened this conversation for us. I'm going to ask you to close it here and tie a few things together for our audience. There's a phrase that we've danced around throughout this whole discussion, user adoption. Why is user adoption so important as these, formerly disparate areas come together? Artificial intelligence, logistics.
Yeah, so to answer that question, the way I think about it is at a pretty high level, right? So, in many ways, some of the processes that we run today can trace their roots back to the 1950s and 60s, and they are tried and true, right? They've served the U.S. military for 70 or 80 years, in some cases longer, and they've made us the superpower that we are today. And so a lot of the, the upbringing of individuals in positions of, from the senior echelons all the way down to the tactical edge, that acclimatization to those processes is something that data and AI is a challenge to. Right? It's going to force us to think differently about the opportunity. It's going to force us to think differently about performance. It's going to force us to be more creative. And so the way I like to think about it is, the reality is it's about a 30% of a 30% technical problem and a 70% cultural. And if you double click into cultural, it comes back to our willingness to be able to just start, right? Get moving, right? And to understand how it impacts your ability to perform better. And luckily at SOCOM, we have a healthy obsession with performance. And so, this really is the best incubator for a lot of these efforts.
Great place to close it. Wonderful conversation with Brandon Bean, the AI and ML capability lead for the Defense, CTO, and the TRIO driving data for USSOCOM, Dan Folliard, Chris Paone, and Mike Petee. Thank you all.
Thanks, George.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
George.
Thanks for having us on.